The Economic Club of Minnesota's mission is to provide a world-class, nonpartisan forum for national and international leaders in business and public policy to discuss ideas that affect how Minnesota can better compete in the global economy. The Economic Club of Minnesota, engaging the world, strengthening Minnesota.
I am honored to have been asked to talk to you today and delighted to be here. Maybe it seems brave to fly into the teeth of a Minnesota snowstorm, but in fact, my friends in Washington are pretty sure that I was running out of town because of some of the attention that our recent analyses have garnered. I'm very pleased to be here. I did realize belatedly that my presentation has nothing in it about hockey. And I realized this partly last night when I arrived, and another classmate of Narayana's and mine, Lucy Swift, who lives here, told me when she picked me up in the car that Minnesota was very focused on hockey right now, and I better have something to say about it, which I don't. And then this morning I had a phone call from a friend of mine who works at CBO who is a hockey fan, saying, I told you should have learned more about hockey, and you really should have before you went. So all I can say is I hope our hockey teams do really well. But now I'm going to talk about other things. What I want to So I want to talk about the federal budget. And I'll talk for a while, and then I'll leave time for questions. The federal budget deficit has fallen very sharply from its peak in 2009 of $1.4 trillion, almost 10% of GDP, to we estimate about $500 billion, or 3% of GDP this year. That's good news. However, the nation has not made the fundamental choices about the federal budget that it needs to make. Sometimes we talk about the lawmakers not having made the choices, but more fundamentally, we as citizens have not made these choices. And because the choices have not been made, the federal debt remains on an unsustainable path. And also, very importantly, the composition of federal spending is changing dramatically from what it has been in the past. So I'm going to talk about two basic questions today. First, what is the outlook for the budget under current law? And secondly, what criteria might be used by lawmakers and by us as citizens to evaluate policy changes. Before I do that, though, let me just say a few words about what CBO is for those of you who are in the state that Narayana and I were in 1979, which was not knowing what the CBO does. The CBO provides objective, nonpartisan information to Congress. In particular, we make what we call baseline projections of federal budget outcomes under current law, and we make estimates of the effects of changes in federal policies, sometimes in collaboration with JCT, which stands for the Joint Committee on Taxation, and has a professional staff somewhat analogous to CBO staff working for Congress. These estimates apply to legislation being developed by committees, so specific bills. We had made estimates of 500 pieces of legislation last year that were being voted out of committees, and thousands of pieces of legislation that were being developed behind the scenes. We also analyzed conceptual proposals being put together by people on and off the Hill. And as Narayana said, we make no recommendations. And we make no recommendations because policy choices are not just about knowing the pros and cons of a policy option, but attaching your value judgments to the importance of those pros and cons. We have nothing special to say about value judgments, so our job is just to lay out the pros and cons of different policies. Now, our estimates usually focus on the next 10 years. That's the standard budget window, but we look out over longer periods of time, sometimes as well. Our estimates are meant to reflect the middle of a distribution of possible outcomes. We're very aware of the uncertainty of our work. Sometimes we're able to quantify that uncertainty, but always we think about our work as having some estimate that has roughly equal chances of being too low or too high. Our work incorporates, where we can, the behavioral responses that we expect, the way that individuals or businesses, state and local governments, and federal administrators or programs will respond to possible changes in law. We use whatever evidence we can find to get a handle on those behavioral responses. And sometimes that evidence is formal, published studies in academic journals. Other times it's phone calls to state Medicaid directors or business people in some line of work. We change our estimates sometimes in response to new analysis, new evidence. It's our job to give Congress our current best sense of what will happen under current law or under a policy change. And if there's new work we can do that gives a different sense than we had before, then it's our job to give the new estimate and to explain what we've learned and why our views are different. And where we can, we provide explanations of our estimates. So that's a brief bit about us. Let's go on to the budget. What is the outlook for the budget under current law? Well, I'll start with a picture of the deficit up through 2007. This is the deficit as a share of GDP. And you can see the deficit's averaged about 3% of GDP over the past 40 years. In 2008, what happened was that the economy turned down. And when the economy turns down, tax revenues fall automatically, and spending rises a bit automatically for programs like unemployment insurance. So the deficit widens. 2009, of course, the economy did much worse. In addition, policymakers enacted a set of policies to try to, set of fiscal policies to try to arrest the drop in the economy. And those policies made the deficit larger as well. Now, since 2009, deficits have narrowed. And this shows the last point is the projection, is the estimate for last year. And looking ahead over the next decade, we think deficits will fall for another couple of years, but then widen again, increase a bit as a share of GDP, and increase beyond what their average had been, but still fairly close to the historical average. What is not at all close to this historical average is the outstanding stock of federal debt, which is more or less the cumulative deficits in the past. This is a picture of federal debt starting in 1940. You can see the sharp spike during the Second World War, and then the decline after the war. And the decline came not because the federal government ran large surpluses. The budget was roughly balanced, but because with a balanced budget, debt was about flat, and GDP was rising very strongly. After this sharp decline, then deficits moved up and down, but in a general sense, sideways over the next several decades, staying between about 25 and 50% of GDP. And in some of those periods, those movements seemed like a big deal, but in retrospect now, they seem kind of contained. Because what happened after the last point in this picture is shown in this picture, and you can see the sharp run-up in the debt because of these large deficits during the past several years. And under our projections of what will happen under current law, we have the debt rising a little bit over as a share of GDP over the next 10 years. And other projections, and I'll show you a bit of this later, where we look out beyond 10 years, show debt continuing to rise. So federal debt is now at an unusually high level, not just in nominal dollars, but relative to the size of the economy. Unusual in our history and unusual by the standards of most developed countries in most years. Well, what's that coming from? So this picture, let me go back to this. So this picture shows revenues and spending over the last 40 years, which is a standard comparison period that we use. You can see the sharp drop in revenues during the past few years, but then revenues climbing back up. And we think that revenues will move a little above their historical average share over the next decade. Spending, which had this large hump during the past several years, has fallen as a share of GDP, but we think will rise again. And you want to, in some sense, take that rise over the next decade as an extrapolation, leaving aside the hump, but an extrapolation of the trend from earlier in the 2000s. And I'll talk about the reasons why spending is on this upward trajectory. So here I'm actually going to skip over this slide because I have a better slide later, I think, to show some of these points. So this is projected spending in major budget categories over the next decade. So the, I guess, yellow or orange line, I'm colorblind, so I have a little trouble with this kind of slide. The line that now says Social Security shows Social Security spending as a share of GDP, and it rises over the decade. And it rises basically because the share of Americans who will be collecting Social Security is going to rise a lot. There will be 1/3 more Americans receiving Social Security benefits 10 years from now than there are today. Very dramatic increase in the number of beneficiaries of the program. The next line is major health care programs. This is Medicare, which provides health care for older Americans, Medicaid, which focuses on health care for low-income Americans, both old and young, and the subsidies to be provided through the new insurance exchanges. Health care spending rises more rapidly than Social Security because it's driven up by the aging of the population, but also by rising costs of health care per person and by an expansion in federal subsidies for health care under the Affordable Care Act. The next line that rises a lot is net interest payments on the federal debt. This very large amount of debt that we have has not translated in the past few years to large government interest payments because interest rates have been extraordinarily low. But we expect interest rates to return to more typical levels over the next 5 years. And with more typical interest rates and very high levels of debt, level of government interest payments will be quite high by historical standards. The line that goes down shows all other spending by the federal government. So it's a collection of defense spending, of benefit programs, apart from the ones I just mentioned, things like food stamps or unemployment insurance benefits, and this large category called non-defense discretionary spending, which is everything else the government does, basically voted on by Congress in its funding each year. So that includes veterans' health care, it includes transportation funding, it includes significant amounts of education funding, the weather service, the courts, and many other things. That spending is on a path to decline as a share of GDP, and decline by about 2020 to a smaller share of GDP than at any point since at least 1940, which is the last year for which we have comparable data. So the growth of government spending is not growth of the government writ large. Most of the government will be smaller relative to the size of the economy than has been in the past. The growth of overall government spending, overall federal government spending, comes from growth in a few large programs, primarily Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Now, what's causing that shift in the composition of spending? Well, I've talked about many of these items. There's aging of the population. There's the expansion of federal subsidies for health insurance, rising healthcare costs per person, the return of interest rates to more typical levels, and the last point here, caps on discretionary funding. Congress agreed in 2011 to impose limits looking out over a decade on how much it would allocate each year to defense and non-defense purposes. But it did not specify, almost could not have specified, what particular programs would be funded or not funded. The whole issue about these other programs is their funding is decided every year by the Congress. So what Congress has established is an overall cap, or set of caps, but it hasn't made the actual harder choices about what programs will thrive and what programs will be cut back. And in fact, the past couple of years, Congress has found that the caps that they had agreed to in 2011 are tighter than they feel that they can fund the activities that people want out of the government. So they've actually bumped those caps up a little bit. Okay, so that's what will happen if we don't make any policy changes. What criteria might we use to evaluate policy changes? I want to list 4, and then I'll come back and talk about each one in turn. So the first criterion is simply what role would the federal government play in society? What do we want our national government to do, and what do we want it not to do? The second criterion for evaluating policy changes is how much would deficits be reduced relative to what I've shown you that we think would happen under current law. The third criterion is what would the economic impact be in both the short term and the long term of deficit reduction, and I'll come back to this as well. And the fourth criterion is who would bear the burden of changes in tax and spending policies. Not only would the overall size of the economy be affected, but the shares of economic output and income going to particular people would be affected by policy changes as well. So let me go through each of these a little more carefully in turn. What role would the federal government play in society? Well, this is partly a question about how large one wants federal spending to be in total. It's also a question of what one wants the composition of federal spending to be. More on defense, less on non-defense, more for young people, less on old people, or the reverse of those. It's about how much we want federal taxes to be, recognizing that there needs to be some relationship between the amount of spending and the amount of taxes. They don't have to literally be equal, but if they're unequal to a sufficient degree, as we think they are under current law, then we have a situation of unsustainable increases in debt. So the amount of taxes, the amount of spending should not be considered as independent matters. But I also want to focus in terms of taxes, not just on the total amount of taxes, but on the features of the tax code. There's something called tax expenditures. This was a term invented a number of years ago to refer to provisions of the tax code that work a lot like federal spending, in that they are provisions that provide subsidies for particular activities undertaken by particular people. So the mortgage interest deduction is a tax expenditure. The federal government could have a spending program to subsidize people's mortgage interest payments. We don't. We have a tax program to subsidize people's mortgage interest payments. And the tax program is you can deduct your payments under some conditions and up to certain levels. Tax expenditures are a very large amount of money. In this year, the federal government will forego tax revenues of more than $1 trillion, given this system of rates, because of these special provisions, these tax expenditures. So those provisions don't get voted on year by year like much of other official spending does. But they're out there and they're quite important in terms of what the tax code is doing to the economy and what it's doing to or for particular people. Okay, this chart goes a little deeper into the question about what the federal government, about the composition of federal spending. If you start on the left, these show the main categories of federal spending as shares of GDP. The darker dots are what happened last year, fiscal year 2013, and the light dots are our projection 25 years from now. So this is drawn from our long-term budget outlook. You can see Social Security spending rising a little bit as a share of the economy. Spending for major healthcare programs rising much more dramatically. And again, that's the aging of the population. It's rising health spending per person, and it's this expansion of the number of people being helped through federal programs. But defense spending is falling as a share of the economy. Non-defense discretionary spending is falling as a share of the economy. Other benefit programs are falling as a share of the economy. Net interest rises very sharply here. That's partly because of this return of interest rates to more typical levels. It's also because by 25 years out, without changes in law, the debt is getting to be quite large. So there's a snowballing effect, which interest rates are pushed up and then the debt rises faster. And there's nothing necessarily wrong with this shift in the allocation of federal spending. But I emphasize it here because it is a shift that I don't think we have voted for or decided upon in any explicit way. We have one set of programs where we set out benefit rules, eligibility rules, and then certain amounts of money get spent. We have other programs we vote on year after year. And because of the way those programs are set up, and because of the changes in our demographics and changes in the healthcare system and so on, we are unfolding a future that's different from the past without our having, I think, actually had the national conversation about what we think the federal government should do. Now, one thing I want to emphasize on healthcare, as you know, the Affordable Care Act is expanding federal support for health insurance for low and lower middle income people in a considerable way. And that is pushing up our projections of federal spending. But it's worth recognizing that even once that law is fully implemented, that most federal healthcare spending will go toward care for older people. So in our projections for 2024, Medicare spending is about $900 billion. Medicaid and CHIP, CHIP is the Children's Health Insurance Program. It's pretty small compared with Medicaid. Medicaid, as I mentioned, as you probably know, funds healthcare for lower income Americans. Most Medicaid beneficiaries by number are under age 65, but most spending by dollars goes to people over age 65 because older people tend to be more expensive. Medicaid pays for something like 40% of all nursing home bills in the country. And then there's another piece, which is the exchange subsidies on some related items from the Affordable Care Act. If you break this down by the beneficiary characteristics, we found in our projections that about 3/5 of the money will go toward care for people over the age of 65. About 1/5 will go for people who are blind or disabled, and the remaining 1/5 will go toward non-disabled, non-elderly beneficiaries. Again, nothing necessarily right or wrong about that, but important to understand if one contemplates policy changes. So the second criterion I mentioned was how much would deficits be reduced. If you look at the effect 25 years from now of a reduction of $2 trillion in deficits over this decade, which is the way people in Washington tend to talk about it. What's the 10-year total? So the 10-year reduction were $2 trillion, but you kept the policies in place after that. Then by 25 years from now, you would manage to keep debt from rising as a share of GDP. You would have kept it about the same share of GDP it is today. And if you instead did $4 trillion of deficit reduction over this decade and kept that going, then you'd have brought debt back down 25 years from now to about where it was over the last 40 years, or the 40 years preceding the run-up even. It takes you back down to about where you were in 2007. So those are pretty big numbers, even in the federal budget. If you want to reduce the deficit by $4 trillion in this decade, and you want to do that only through changes in Social Security and the major healthcare programs, you need to cut benefits by about 1/5. If you wanted to do it through other non-interest spending, you need to cut that spending by more than 1/5. If you want to do it only through increases in tax revenue, you have to raise tax revenue by about 1/10. Or, of course, you could do some combination. But it's worth understanding just how big the changes need to be in order to accomplish this particular goal of $4 trillion. That may or may not be the right goal. Nothing in economics says the ideal level of federal debt is X. But if you want to go back to where we were, these are the magnitude of the changes that would be needed. Okay, what would the economic impact be of policies to reduce the deficit? Well, in the short term, reductions in federal spending or increases in federal taxes would generally reduce demand for goods and services, thereby lowering output and employment. And that effect would tend to be especially strong under current economic conditions. If the economy were running along smoothly and the federal funds rate was well above zero, then if there was some contractionary effect of fiscal policy, monetary policy makers could respond to that by running a slightly more expansionary monetary policy to offset that effect on the economy. That option is not readily available now. So in the short term, the policies that would reduce deficits would actually restrain economic activity. It's different in the long term. In the long term, reductions in deficits would generally increase national saving and investment, thereby raising output and income. And the reason the deficit reduction has different effects in the short term and the long term is because in the short term, under current conditions, the real constraint on economic activity is the weak demand for goods and services. But in the longer term, we think will be the case, as has been the case for much of our history, the constraint will be the ability of the economy to produce goods and services. It's the labor force, quantity and quality. It's the capital stock. It's productivity and so on. When we do estimates of the effects of changes in fiscal policy on the economy, we keep track of the effects of changes in deficits. We also keep track of the effects of changes in tax rates. So increases in marginal tax rates, which might be one tool for reducing deficits, would have a beneficial effect if they reduce deficits, but also a negative effect on the economy by reducing the incentive to work and to save. And we try to model that and quantify the effects of that. At the same time, if one changed certain sorts of federal spending, that could have long-term economic effects. In this pool of spending called non-defense discretionary spending, the non-defense things that are voted on each year, about half of that spending represented an investment of some sort in physical capital like highways, in what economists call human capital, education, and in research and development. And cutbacks in that could have negative effects on the economy as well. So when we do analyses, and when people think about the effects of fiscal policies over time on the economy, they should think not just about the effects of changes in deficits, but also about the effects of the specific policies that are being used. Okay, and the last criterion I talked about was who would bear the burden of changes in tax and spending policies. And let me give you some background for that conversation, which is what's happening today, what's happened over time to income and transfer payments and tax payments across the income distribution. This chart shows the cumulative growth in average after-tax income since 1979. This income includes, this is people's market income. We've added to that transfer payments they receive from the federal government, and we subtracted from that taxes they've paid to the federal government. And we think of the taxes they've paid in sort of broad terms. It's not just their personal income tax payments. It's what they and their employer have paid on their behalf for payroll taxes. And there's also corporate tax payments that we assign to households based on their capital, on their wealth, their capital holdings. So over this last 40 or so years, 30 years, you can see that people in the lowest quintile, in the 21st to 80th percentile, and the 81st to 99th percentile have had real income gains. And on a different sort of scale, those gains would stand out more. But the top 1% has had much larger income gains. Now, federal policy has also changed over time. So this picture shows federal tax rates for the same income groups over the last 30 years, and then a projection for 2013. Let me explain what this is. So this takes the measure of income I talked about before, your market income plus any transfer income you receive. That's the denominator. And the numerator in the calculation is this total amount of taxes that you pay and is paid on your behalf. So it's not the tax bracket that you think you're in. It is the overall share of your income measured largely that's paid in taxes, also measured in a broad way. You can see here the bottom line shows people in the lowest quintile. So their average tax rate has fallen on balance over time. It fell particularly for the past couple of years because of this temporary reduction in payroll tax rates. And our projection for 2013, I should be clear, the history here draws an actual date on income and actual data on taxes paid. The 2013 number is our projection using the income distribution from 2010, but applying 2013 tax law. So in 2013, that dot you see there on the bottom is a little higher than the line before that, so that the tax rate that lowest quintile would pay would be a little higher than it's been the last few years, but still at the low end of its range over the past few decades. And similarly, for the middle 60% and for the 81st to 99th percentiles, tax rates have generally moved down over time. And the 2013 level that we project under current law is low by the standards of the last 30 years. It's a rather different situation in the top. So in the top 1%, the projection for 2013 is at the top end of the range of the last 30 years. And the patterns here come from a few sources, particularly the 2001 and 2003 tax cuts. You can see the drop in the tax burden at that time across the income distribution. Those tax cuts were extended for most people, but not extended when they expired for people at the top. And that's the most important reason why the top 1% tax rate we project will be high relative to its history of that line, whereas for the other groups, the tax rate will be lower. We've also done work on the distribution of federal spending alongside federal taxes. So this work actually drew on data we only had through 2006 when we did it. Let me explain this picture. This is, these three bars on the left are all for elderly households. The left bar is the amount of transfers, the average amount of transfers received by elderly households in 2006. And it was a number close to $30,000. The average household in that group paid taxes of a little under $15,000, so that their net of transfers minus taxes was $12,000 or so. This doesn't capture all of federal spending because we're only keeping track here of the transfer payments that go to particular households. Things like defense spending, the weather service, other sorts of public goods. I'm not showing you pictures of here. We did a little work on that in this report as well. But I'm focusing here on things that come directly from or to households, recognizable, defined burdens or benefits. If you look at the similar picture for non-elderly households with children, it looks quite different. Their transfer payments received were quite a bit lower. Their taxes paid were quite a bit higher than for elderly households. So on net, they're paying in taxes. And the same thing is true for non-elderly households without children. We then went back and broke this down by non-elderly households of different income levels. So this shows, just for non-elderly households, the lowest quintile. So they receive some transfers. They pay a little bit in tax. Again, this is taxes broadly defined. This group does not generally pay income tax, but a number of those members of those households work, so they're paying some payroll tax. Their transfers greatly exceed the taxes, so transfers minus taxes are positive. For the second quintile, transfers are lower and taxes are higher, roughly in balance. And for the third, fourth, and fifth quintiles, taxes exceed transfers. And again, because I'm not keeping track in this picture of the general federal spending, like for defense, taxes are going to have to exceed transfers in this kind of picture. But the distribution of that is quite distinct. Different households at different places of the income distribution, and different households at different ages receive very different things from the federal government and pay very different things to the federal government. And as we think about changes in federal policies, an important consideration is not just what they will do to the overall economy, but what they will do to the well-being of elderly versus non-elderly households, of households high in income distribution versus households low in income distribution, and within groups of households of the same income and same age, changes, for example, in tax rules could have very different effects on different sorts of families, those living in higher tax or lower tax states, or higher cost or lower cost areas, or areas with higher or lower healthcare costs. So there's a lot of possible richness and a lot of possible interest and concern by policymakers and I think by citizens in how changes in policies would shake out to affect different people. So I will conclude at this point by just reminding you of where I started, that relative to the size of the economy, debt remains historically high and is on an upward trajectory by the second half of the coming decade and beyond. And that the fundamental budget challenge has hardly been addressed. The largest federal programs are becoming much more expensive because primarily of the retirement of the baby boom generation and the rising cost of healthcare. So we will need to cut back on those programs or increase tax revenue to pay for them, or cut other federal spending even further by historical standards, or adopt some combination of those approaches. And on that cheery note, I will stop. Thank you very much.
So in general, the future of our budget, future for our budget looks a lot like the future weather we're facing here in Minnesota, I guess. Let me start with the first question, and put your hands up for questions. I think we have a couple of mics going around here. I'll ask the first question, which is, you recently did a report on how the Affordable Care Act would have a disincentive to work that would reduce the level of employment. As we take that a step further, how does that impact the deficit and the debt?
Well, I have my mic, I guess. So our projections of the federal budget are consistent with our projections of the economy, and our projections of the economy are consistent with our projections for the federal budget, in the sense that our economic outlook depends on how we think federal tax and spending policies will influence the economy, and on how every other influence we can keep track of will influence the economy. So the effects of the Affordable Care Act on the labor force are one of the elements that enters into our labor force projections.
Great. So that would imply that if the employment's going down, there would be a negative impact on the economy.
Well, there are a lot of possible channels through which the Affordable Care Act would affect the economy, and we've not kept track of all of those together. In this particular round of our projections, we devoted a special attention to the labor market, recognizing how surprising some of the developments have been over the past several years, and recognizing how important the labor market is to people. So we did a deeper dive than we have in the last few years into labor market issues. And much of that was reported in a separate report we released a few weeks ago with our outlook called The Slow Recovery of the Labor Market. And most of that report is about things unrelated to federal fiscal policies. But as part of that, we also did another look at the effects of the Affordable Care Act. So that was just a piece that got extra attention from us in this occasion.
Great. Other questions in the audience? I know I got right over here.
Dr. Elmendorf, thanks for coming to Minnesota. You and your colleagues at CBO have just released a report on the minimum wage. And so it's a follow-up question to that. Labor participation rates are at an all-time low. Your report says that a raise in the rate would cost jobs. For those interested in more jobs, any advice?
Well, our report on the minimum wage said that there were a number of effects of increasing the minimum. We concluded that depending on how, we looked at two different increases, an increase from the current $7.25 to $9, and an increase from the current $7.25 to $10.10 indexed for inflation. For both those increases, we found that there would probably be small reduction in the number of people who would be employed, a much larger number of people who would receive higher wages and be better off from that, and then indirectly some people who would receive lower income, more or less offsetting the people who would earn higher wages. So the report looks at the effects on employment, and it looks at the effects on income of people at different levels in the income distribution. Labor force participation rates are at low levels. I don't think they're at all-time low levels, but they are at low levels, and there are a few reasons for that. Part of that is just changing demographics. As people move from, the baby boomers move from their 40s and 50s to their 60s and 70s, their participation in the labor force will fall a lot, and we're seeing that in the data. In addition, there was a large increase in women's labor force participation in the 70s and 80s that has more or less leveled off. So that boost to participation in that era is not repeating itself now. And there are some other factors as well, including right at the moment, the fact that the labor market is very weak. So the participation rate is depressed now beyond what just would have happened because of the demographic changes, because people who can't find work are to some extent not looking for work anymore. Unless they don't count as unemployed, they count as out of the labor force. And we think that's a pretty big deal. We think there are about 3 million people who are out of the labor force who would come back in if the economy were stronger, and who we think will come back in over the next several years as the economy and labor market strengthen. So if one's interested in raising labor force participation or employment, then one can do a variety of things. In the short term, more expansionary fiscal or monetary policy would boost employment. Over the longer term, the more important factor under control of or influenced by the government is tax rates and to some extent wage rates. So changes, people respond to these economic incentives. the federal government were to lower tax rates, that could encourage people to join the labor force. If changes could be made in the economy to give people more education so that they could then be more productive, they would earn higher wages, and that would tend to increase labor force participation. So there's a range of policies that could be considered that could matter, but I think one should not think there's any silver bullet out there that would somehow offset the effects of millions of Americans moving from a point in their lives to a different point in their lives and changing how much they work in response to that. Individuals don't think about the aggregate effects. For any individual turning 65, things seem no different than they did to people turning 65 10 years ago or 10 years before that, in a sense, from their own decision making. But it turns out that if we as a country had these bulges in our population, then a lot of things happen at the aggregate level, even if individuals are doing the same sorts of things they were doing before.
Great. Other questions? Over here, if you could please identify yourself. Thank you, Craig Shaver, for that question.
Yes, Tom Camp with Cornerstone Capital. Thank you for your visit today. The CBO has often been criticized for doing what's called a static analysis versus a dynamic analysis, especially with regard to changes in tax policy. My question relates to the recent study on the increase in the minimum wage. And was that a static analysis, or are you considering some dynamic changes that people would do as a result, both employers as well as employees, as a result of the change in the minimum wage?
So I don't think we do static analyses, but people do accuse us of that. As I said, we try to incorporate behavioral responses to policy changes. That is the essence of what we do. That's the part that makes our jobs interesting and hard. It's not hard to take an existing tax base, an existing number of people, and multiply that by some slightly smaller or larger number. The thing that's hard and interesting is thinking how people will respond to that. So we always do that. What we don't always do is to allow for changes in overall economic conditions. And this is what the static versus dynamic debate has grown out of. For most of our analyses, most of our estimates, we hold overall wages, overall GDP fixed. And the reason for that, I think, is that for the vast majority of the work that we do, the policies we're looking at are small and targeted enough, there would be no significant macroeconomic effects. So as I said, we did 500 formal written cost estimates last year. We probably did 10 times as many informal estimates. And 99% of those times, there were no significant, the policy just could not have an important macroeconomic effect. So that's why we don't allow and try to keep track of potential macroeconomic changes most of the time. It wouldn't add any information to the Congress's decisions, and it would require 10 times as many of us to try to do those analyses, and it would take a long time. However, when there are changes being contemplated that are intended to have and would plausibly have large macroeconomic effects, then we try to do those analyses. So for the immigration legislation the Senate considered last year, and for immigration legislation considered in the Congress half a dozen years ago, the policy is being set up and fought over in large measure about bringing more people into the country. So in that circumstance, for us to do an estimate that said, well, let's just assume there's no change in the labor force, would have been, CBO thought, quite perverse. So for those estimates of immigration, again, last year and before that, in those cases, we did analyses of some macroeconomic effects. We did those largely as a separate issue from the basic estimate. And there are some footnotes to that. But basically, we try to keep the central estimate focused on the way we normally do estimates and do separate macroeconomic analysis. That's partly because the separate macroeconomic analysis often takes longer and creates different additional levels of uncertainty. So for example, every year we do an analysis of the president's budget proposals, and we do an estimate of that for fixed economic assumptions. That comes out first, and Congress uses that in various ways right away. And then it takes us about a month longer to complete an economic analysis of the president's budget, which takes account of changes in deficits and changes in tax rates and so on. So we do these economic analyses separately, but we do them. We've built up the capacity to do them. And in my time at CBO, we spent a lot of effort improving that capacity to do the kind of economic analysis. But we do it in the cases when it matters, and we don't do it in other cases.
Next question.
Steve Kelly, Humphrey School of Public Affairs. You identified healthcare costs increasing as one of the factors in the future deficit challenge we have. There's been a recent slowing in the inflation rate in healthcare. costs, but as you're doing the projections, what are you assuming with respect to the rate of healthcare inflation with respect to the growth of the economy or to the CPI?
So there has been, as you say, a pronounced slowdown in the growth of health spending across the country, in private insurance, in Medicaid, in Medicare. We did a very thorough analysis of Medicare spending last year, and the slowdown can be seen in bills for hospitals, bills for doctors. It can be seen in high-cost regions of the country and low-cost regions of the country for high-cost patients and low-cost patients. It's been quite pervasive. And in response to that, we have significantly reduced our projections of federal healthcare spending. So relative to 4 years ago or so, we've taken down our projection of Medicare and Medicaid spending in 2020 by 10 to 15%. And we've lowered our projection of the growth rate of spending beyond that as well. The challenge for us is that there have been periods in the past when healthcare spending has slowed and has been followed by a resurgence of growth in healthcare spending. So we're trying to adjust our projections to be in the middle of the distribution, recognizing that if we are seeing some true turning point, then we will have projections that are sitting too high. On the other hand, if there is some rebound, then we'll end up with projections that will have looked too low. And as I say, for Medicare, we did this very careful analysis ourselves. Other analysts have done analyses of other parts of the healthcare system. In Medicare, it looks to us like the slowdown is not related to the weak economy or the loss of assets by older people. A little of it can be linked to changes in federal policies. Much of it seems to be, much of it that we couldn't quantify, but talked about, were changes in the way healthcare is being practiced, delivered, sought by patients. So we think that's a real thing. It's a real structural change. Which we think is bringing down the level. I mean, our level of projected healthcare spending never gets back to where it used to be. But we've not lowered the growth rate by a huge amount indefinitely. I think we're right to be cautious. Much of the healthcare system, Medicare, for example, is still largely fee-for-service, still largely incentives to do more or build more. And I think that is changing, but it has not gone away.
And I'm sure your folks told you that we're not only the state of hockey, but also the state of healthcare innovation here. So we're, I'm sure, helping to drive that as well.
Yes.
Question over here.
Hi, Paul Cook from UBS. Two-part question relating to your slide that talked about the percentage of tax rate by top 1% on down through the quintiles. Is there an economic impact forecasted in this drag, or is there a drag forecasted as a result of the top 1% having a dramatic spike above their historic averages?
Yes.
Is there an emotional, behavioral impact which would have an economic impact on a large percentage of our population paying very little, if at all, virtually no taxes on a percentage of their income? So does their behavior, lack of incentive to work, lack of incentive on the growth? So, and is there a number on the high side where you say the drag far outweighs the, what's the number that gets to be too much on the high side, and what's the effect of a lot of people paying virtually nothing?
So I think my answers were all yes up to that last point where my answer became no. So our economic projections take explicit account of the incentives to work and save through the federal tax code and through federal transfer payments. There's a large literature about how people's labor supply responds to changes in tax rates. We did a review of that literature with the help of members of our panel of economic advisors a couple of years ago, wrote 3 papers summarizing how we read the literature and how we draw estimates from it to use in this kind of analysis. And we use that in a very consistent way, and we use that in looking at the effects of changes in tax rates at the very top, and we use that in looking at changes in incentives to work through the Affordable Care Act and the work we released a few weeks ago. That doesn't say that the responses are exactly the same across the income distribution. There are different opportunities that people have at different levels, and the research literature and our estimates try to take account of that. But we do think about those effects across the income distribution. We do not have some level of the tax rate that is sort of the highest it ought to go. And that's because economists have no basis for reaching that conclusion. There is a disincentive effect of higher tax rates. On the other hand, revenue is collected through higher tax rates, well beyond the level the tax rates are at today. So you know about the Laffer curve. Tax rates can be high enough to actually reduce the amount of revenue that's collected. But the US tax code is not near that at this point in time. So more revenue is collected through higher tax rates. But it's sure enough, as you push tax rates higher, the incremental revenue is positive but less and less, and the distortion gets greater and greater. But there's no analytic way to say what the right point is to be at. That's a judgment people need to make. And I think it depends, importantly, on what else one wants the government to do. So you can't think about taxes and spending in isolation. And if you want to have a certain set of programs, a certain set of government functions being undertaken, then you need to raise almost that amount of money through tax revenue to have a sustainable budget path. So I think people I think correctly think about tax policy and spending policy, but then back to tax policy and around again, because there aren't a lot of easy ways out of this. We published a report last year with maybe 100 different ways of reducing the deficit, and most of them have some pretty unpleasant aspects.
So on those, we have one last question. We're going to let the students studying macroeconomics give us our closing question.
My name is Joe Kahn from Heritage Christian Academy. The question I have for you is, as a representative of kind of the coming generation, becoming more self-aware of economic influence and aggregate responses, what would you recommend our generation can do to compensate for the retiring generation to come? Yeah.
So that's a terrific question. I have twin daughters who are freshmen in college, and they become fond of saying to me when some situation develops, "Daddy, do something." And so I've become fond of saying, "Look, I'm doing all I can. If more needs to be done, then you're the ones who get to do it." So to all of you at that table, the rest of us are at this table too, I guess. The rest of us are counting on you. I think we're counting on you to work hard, and we're counting on you to inform yourselves about public policy. The decisions we need to make here are not decisions that are just our legislators to make. And our legislators' inability to tackle these fundamental challenges come not just because they are unwilling to think about it. It comes in large measure because the voters, we and our fellow citizens, have not decided where we come out on these issues, or to some extent we've decided in very disparate ways, but we have not sat down together and worked out what we think should happen. So I think the first step in that is to have people understand what is going on in the federal budget and in all other aspects of the economy. So your economics class is a good start. I hope you'll keep taking economics and keep following these issues and coming like other people do to these fora to hear people talk and to read carefully and read critically the things that you read and to use that to participate in the public discussion. I wish you a lot of luck. Thank you.
Very good. And on that note, let's give our speaker one more round of applause.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much.
The Economic Club of Minnesota's mission is to provide a world-class, nonpartisan forum for national and international leaders in business and public policy to discuss ideas that affect how Minnesota can better compete in the global economy. The Economic Club of Minnesota, engaging the world, strengthening Minnesota.